Love and obsession would lead Ruth Ellis to murder her lover, David Blakely. It would take less than half an hour for the jury to come back with a guilty verdict. She would be the last woman ever to be sentenced to death in the UK. Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel and Killer Concepts. If you are new here, my name is Peyton, and we talk about all things true crime. Before we get started, please make sure to hit that red subscribe button down below and turn on your post notifications so that you do not miss any future content. Today we are talking about the case of Ruth Ellis. Ellis's case has become something that many people are intrigued by, most likely because she was the last woman who was ever executed in the UK when she was hanged on July 13th, 1955 at age 28. Her execution caused somewhat of an outcry as her victim was her lover, who she had a very tumultuous relationship with, and a lot of people did not agree with her sentence. It is believed that her case had a huge impact on ending the death penalty in the UK. As always, I am going to start by giving you a little bit more information on who Ellis and her victim David Blakely were. To begin, I just want to start off by saying I have found a lot of contradicting dates and statements about Ellis's life, so I have done my best to piece it together accurately. Ruth Ellis was born on October 9th, 1927 in Ryle, Wales. Ellis was born Ruth Nielsen, whose original family name was actually Hornby, but her father was a cellist from Manchester who used the stage name Arthur Nielsen. Her father mainly played on cruise liners. Personally, I don't think I would be getting on a cruise liner so soon after the Titanic wreck of 1912, but that's just me, and I'm a paranoid person. But anyway, her mother, Elisabetta, was half French, half Belgian, who came to the UK during World War I and the German invasion of Belgium. Ellis would be one of 5 children who were all raised as strict Catholics. But Ellis wanted to be more and make more out of herself. Ellis's family would move in 1941, and when she was 14 years old, she would leave school and begin working as a waitress. At age 16, she would begin to make the most of her looks. She became known to have a little bit of a problem with men since the time she was young. At the age of 17, she fell in love with a French-Canadian soldier named Claire, but this relationship would be short-lived as he was apparently a married man. I also read in some other articles that he was killed in action, but I've seen more accounts that he never died, so we're gonna go with that. On September 15th, 1945, Ellis would give birth to her son, who she would name Claire Andrea, and would receive child support from his father, and his father would visit. At this time, Ellis was still living with her family. Her son's father would move back to Canada to be with his family, and he would inform Ellis by sending her a bunch of roses and a letter. The child support payments would stop here. Being a single mother, Ellis had to do something to support herself, but clerical and factory jobs did not pay enough, and she would start working as a nude model before she would become a nightclub hostess. Not only was she a nightclub hostess, but she also dabbled in prostitution to supplement her income. On November 8th, 1950, when she was 23, she would marry a dentist named George Johnson Ellis. He was a 41-year-old divorcee with 2 sons. He had been one of her nightclub customers. Unfortunately, George was an alcoholic and he was abusive when drunk. He would be convinced that Ellis was cheating on him, and this is when their relationship would begin to get violent. Before the two would divorce, Ellis would become pregnant with their daughter Georgina and give birth in 1951. George Ellis would deny the child as his own, and the two would get a divorce, and Ruth would momentarily move back in with her parents. 3 years later, in 1953, Ellis would move back to London, where she would be the manager of the little club in Mayfair and would start prostituting again. Here she would move into an apartment above the nightclub. This is where she would meet an amateur race car driver named David Blakely, who would become the lover she would eventually shoot to death. So, who was David Blakely? David Blakely was born June 17th, 1929 in Ecclesall, Sheffield. I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly. His father was a Scottish-born doctor and his mother was Irish. Blakely Blakely was educated at Shrewsbury, and he would serve in the National Service in Highland Light Infantry. Their insignia can be found on his tombstone. Originally, before becoming a race car driver, Blakely thought about a career in hotel management, but decided what he really wanted to do was work on race cars and race cars. Blakely was an up-and-coming motor racing driver whose passion was encouraged and financed by his stepfather, Humphrey Wyndham Cook. Cook was also a motor racing driver in the 1930s. Before his death, Blakely was really starting to place well at races and really starting to see his dreams come to fruition. Blakely lived with his mother, Anne, and her husband, who was his stepfather, at the Old Park, Hammersley Lane, Tyler's Green. Later, the three would move to the orchard on Beacon Hill. Now that we have talked about who Ellis and Blakely were, let's dive into their tumultuous relationship. Blakely and Ellis would meet at the Little Club in Mayfair. This place was notorious for being an anything-goes type of club. Here, Ellis was a hostess and manager. At the time the affair began between Blakely and Ellis, Blakely was actually engaged to another woman, but despite this, he would move into Ellis's flat with her. Just like her previous husband, Blakely was known to get pretty violent when drunk. Living above the Little Club, the two would drink frequently, fueling their passionate and violent relationship. The two would say that they wanted to marry, but they never did. Their relationship would become so out of control that Ellis would be fired from her job at the Little Club, and she would move in with RAF pilot Desmond Cusin, who she had started a relationship with while still seeing Blakely. While living with Cusin, she would find out she was pregnant, believing it to be Blakely's child, but he seemed less than interested. Ellis would eventually have a miscarriage, and she would partially blame Blakely because he had gotten violent with her at the time she was pregnant. In early 1955, Blakely apparently told Ellis in the presence of his friends that he wanted to, quote, break off the association, end quote, with her, quote, but she would not let him, end quote. In February of that year, Blakely would move in with Ellis once again to a furnished room in Edgerton Gardens. Just because she started seeing Blakely again didn't mean she fully cut off Desmond Cusin, though. Many times when Blakely left, he would come and visit her. He actually seemed to be kind of her protector. But things were reaching a boiling point, and Blakely started to slowly remove himself from Ellis's life and sometimes even ignore her, which would upset her. But he threw a lot of mixed signals. He would act like he didn't want to be with her, and then he would come back again, and then he would start ignoring her again. He would make promises about taking her out or taking her son somewhere, and then he'd just disappear. On Easter weekend of 1955, everything would finally come to a head. According to the BNA, the Lancaster Evening Post reported that on Good Friday, Blakely would travel to his friend the Findlater's flat to spend the holiday weekend with them. Throughout the day and the early hours the next day, Ellis would incessantly call the Findlater's house. She would ask if Blakely was there, and Mr. Findlater would lie and say that he wasn't, but he definitely was. And she knew it, and it would make her very angry. Early the next morning, Ellis had Cusin drive her to the home where she would bang on the door until the police were called. When the police arrived, Ellis would leave, but she would later come back and she would smash out a bunch of the windows on Blakely's vehicle. On Easter Sunday, April 10th, 1955, the Findlaters were having a party with David Blakely and another acquaintance, but they had run out of alcohol. Blakely and Gunnell went to the Magdala Public House to get some more when, quote, they came out and were getting into the car. There were two bang. Gunnell heard Blakely scream Clive, his Christian name. He went around the back of the car and saw Ellis standing there with a revolver in her hand. Blakely was lying face downwards on the pavement, and he saw Ellis fire more shots into Blakely's back as he lay, end quote, says the Lancashire Evening Post. Ellis had followed them there and shot Blakely to death with a gun that she had gotten from Desmond Cusin. At the time the incident occurred, an off-duty police officer, P.C. Thompson, who was at the Magdala Public House, would run outside because he would hear the gunshots and would find Ellis standing beside Blakely's dead body. Ellis either told him or Gunnell at the time to phone the police, and when she was taken to the police station, she was to have allegedly said, quote, I am guilty. I am rather confused. It started about 2 years ago, end quote. Ruth Ellis would never deny that she was the one who shot and killed Blakely. But according to the BNA, the British newspaper archives, the Daily Herald reported on April 29th, 1955 that Ruth Ellis, quote, pled not guilty and reserved her defense, end quote. She was being sent for trial at the Old Bailey. Ruth Ellis would stand trial at the Old Bailey for the murder of David Blakely on June 20th, 1955. During cross-examination, the prosecutor, Mr. Christmas Humphreys, would ask her only one question, quote, when you fired the revolver at David Blakely, what did you intend to do, end quote. She would reply, quote, when I shot him, I intended to kill him, end quote. While I am sure this answer shocked her defense attorneys, they would respond by bringing to light the alleged abusiveness of Blakely. Police who were investigating the murder had established that the relationship between Ellis and Blakely had been violent. They would find that Blakely would sometimes strike Ellis, and she had been to the hospital multiple times because of bruises from him. But this defense did not save Ellis, and she was fine with it. She had said she expected to die for his murder. Unfortunately, she would leave 2 children behind when she was executed. Her trial would only last a day and a half, and her verdict would be brought back in less than 30 minutes. She would be sentenced to death by hanging. While there was no doubt that Ellis was definitely guilty of the crime, the public were outraged about her being put to death. Maybe it was because some sympathized with her being in an abusive relationship, but that would not be enough. It could also have to do with, at the time, women were seen as very feminine, and to hang a woman for a crime maybe seemed very harsh. The people would start a petition to stop her hanging that would rack up a miraculous 50,000 signatures. But even with the signature, Ellis would be hanged at Holloway Prison on July 13th, 1955. Newspapers would describe her as the, quote, calmest woman who ever went to that gallows, end quote. Albert Pierpoint, who was her executioner, said that she stood in front of him and smiled. He had hanged 430 people, 15 of them being women, but she had been the bravest that stood in front of him. As I said, Ruth Ellis's execution would begin the movement to completely end the death penalty in the UK, and she would be the last woman to ever be sentenced to death. I would be really curious to know what you guys think of the case of Ruth Ellis. Do you think hanging was overkill with the fact that she was abused? I'm not always the biggest fan of the death penalty. I kind of don't fall one way or the other, though. I think there is times where it is something that should be done, but I struggle with the fact that there have been people who have been sentenced to death and then they find out later on that the person really wasn't guilty and they were telling the truth. But in this case, there really is no doubt. Multiple witnesses saw her shoot him. She admitted to shoot him. She intended to shoot him. Just because you're in an abusive relationship does not mean that you can just kill someone. Did she have a psychotic episode? We won't really know. 1955, when the murder happened, was a very different time period than it is now. Women were looked at a lot differently than they are now, and I think maybe that's part of the reason there was such public outrage. It's interesting that she is the last woman who was ever put to death in the UK. Her case did start a movement. People are still fascinated by it, mainly probably because she was the last person put to death. The relationship she was in was definitely very tumultuous. A lot of people who have really studied the case believe that the relationship became very, very obsessive. There was even times where she had tried to leave David Blakely and he would come find her. Like, I believe that happened when she was with Desmond Hewson. There is a movie about this, if you would like to watch it. It was made in the 80s. I think it was like 1985. It's called Dance with a Stranger. I did watch it before I made this. There are some differences between all of the research I did and the movie, but I do think it gives a really good look into the relationship between David Blakely and Ruth Ellis. You always have to take movie remakes with a grain of salt because not everybody knew what happened, but I think it was really well done. It shows the volatility of an abusive relationship. I think it was an abusive relationship. Even if he was the one that was mainly abusing her, she ended up being the one who was also the abuser in the end, and she killed him. So that is all I have for you today. I wanted to cover the case of Ruth Ellis because I stumbled upon it in the book Evil Women by John Harlowe, which I have down below cited. I can also put a link to it down below. I'm sure I can find it on Amazon and link it for you guys if you're interested. And it has all different women. It has Eileen Wuornos, it has Rosemary West, there's all different women, Susan Wright, who I have covered. They're all in there. I think it's very interesting. The book did differ than some of the other information that I found, but it made me really want to cover her, and I found a lot more about her than just what was in the book, which made me happy. But I wanted to cover it. I thought it was interesting, and I saw that it doesn't look like many people have done videos on her. But yeah, that's all I have for you today. If you have not done so already, please hit the red subscribe button and down below and turn on your post notifications so you do not miss any future content. If you have any case suggestions or anything that you would like to send to me, you can send them to killerconceptsvlog@gmail.com. I do try and read the emails. I'm not as good at responding through email as fast as I am through comments, so you can also comment down below. If you have not done so, I also have social media that you can follow me on. I try and keep updates on there. They're all linked down below as well. Before you go, just remember that the world's most dangerous minds hide in the most unlikely places. Stay safe.